In 1951, 8-year-old Benjamin Gray stepped out of his home on Madison Street, holding his small school bag, preparing to head to school like every other morning in Baker City. 5 minutes later, when his sister turned back to look, he had vanished, without a sound, without footprints, without a single item left behind on the dusty road. The search that lasted for months ended in despair. No witnesses, no vehicle identified, not a single piece of solid evidence. The family was reassured that Benjamin had probably wandered into the woods or fallen into the Powder River, and the public gradually accepted it as an unwitnessed accident. The small town spread stories that the boy might have run off with a kind stranger, a rumor repeated to fill the unexplained void. Then in 2005, at a clinic hundreds of miles from Baker City, an administrative staff member discovered an elderly patient named Daniel Creek, who didn't exist in any national database. When his DNA sample was entered into the system, it matched perfectly with the Gray family line. But it was the fragmented memories he carried that turned everything upside down: a mint green Ford, a gravel road, and a wooden cabin door slamming shut behind him. Someone had taken Benjamin away from the town, someone knew the exact moment he was walking alone, and someone had kept that secret for more than half a century, until the truth found its way back. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys in search of forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Oregon in 1951 was a land of seemingly unchanging tranquility, where small towns like Baker City existed in a slow-paced rhythm of trust among neighbors. People were used to children walking to school alone, playing around the neighborhood without much fear, because serious crime was rare in the sparse community, where everyone knew each other's faces. In that setting, the Gray family lived in a small wooden house near Madison Street, typical working-class folks in the post-World War II era. Harold Gray worked for the local railroad, while Evelyn stayed home to care for the kids. They had 2 children, Marjorie 10 years old, mature and responsibly minded for her age, and Benjamin 8 years old, lively, curious, always carrying small notebooks to draw maps of the routes he imagined. Benjamin was a boy with bright eyes, who loved chatting with everyone but was also trusting, a trait Evelyn often worried about, though she still believed Baker City was safe enough to ease those concerns. That morning, like any other, the Gray family started the day with familiar calm. Harold prepared to leave for his early shift. Evelyn reminded the kids to dress warmly before heading to South Baker Elementary. Marjorie left a few minutes ahead as usual, while Benjamin followed at a leisurely pace, wearing the red school bag he loved. The short gap between the siblings was never seen as dangerous, since their route mostly passed familiar homes and a few early opening shops. But that morning, there was one unusual detail no one noticed: a mint green Ford parked near the Madison intersection, its hood slightly protruding into the road as if waiting for someone. A man sat inside, hands on the steering wheel, eyes following the children passing by. Marjorie walked ahead and didn't notice, but as Benjamin approached the car, he slowed down, seemingly drawn by something from the man inside. That moment happened so quickly that no one in town could recall exactly what occurred, only that Benjamin tilted his head as if listening to a question, then stepped a little closer, and that was the last time he was seen by anyone. When Marjorie turned back to check if her brother was keeping up, Benjamin had completely vanished from the gravel road he walked every day. No screams, no signs of struggle, no items dropped, just a sudden emptiness and an eerie silence. Panicked, Marjorie ran back along the path she'd taken, then in the opposite direction, searching in vain. When she ran home to tell her mother, Evelyn rushed outside, calling his name and knocking on every neighbor's door along the street. Harold heard the news mid-shift, dropped everything, and raced home. They split up to check every corner, asking anyone who might have passed by at that hour, but all they got were vague, useless recollections. A few said they might have seen Benjamin continuing toward school but weren't sure. Others thought he'd turned down an alley. No one remembered exact times or reliable details. The first minutes turned into the first hours, calm giving way to panic. Evelyn ran to South Baker Elementary, but found no sign of him. Harold searched the roads where the boy often played, even the nearby park. Helplessness set in as no one had a reasonable explanation. After nearly 2 hours of fruitless searching, Evelyn returned home, hands shaking as she picked up the phone, and for the first time in the Gray family's history, the name Benjamin was reported to the police as a missing child. When Evelyn Gray's call reached the Baker County Sheriff's Office, the information, "an 8-year-old child didn't arrive at school and can't be found," was handled according to 1951 procedures, which did not treat child disappearances as immediate emergencies. In that era's social context, kids often walked miles unaccompanied, sometimes wandered off for hours playing, or visited friends without telling parents. So the initial duty officers assumed Benjamin was just somewhere out wandering. The initial report was logged simply, without risk-level classification or any alert activation. Police asked Harold and Evelyn to double-check friends' houses, ask more neighbors, and report back if he still wasn't found after a few hours, a response reflecting the common complacency of the time. When Harold and Evelyn went to the station in person, the case was taken more seriously, but still not as an emergency. Per protocols then, police filed it as a child wandering, missing person report, and began checking areas a child might reach on their own, rather than approaching it as a possible abduction. No area lockdown was considered, since they believed there were no clear crime signs, no cries for help, no evidence at the scene, no witnesses confirming coercion. However, as statements were collected, the vagueness grew. A witness at the Madison corner only remembered Benjamin walking past but wasn't sure when. A nearby shopkeeper thought he might have seen the boy heading to school, but couldn't recall if it was before or after the school bell. Another vaguely mentioned a light-colored car driving slowly in the neighborhood that morning, but couldn't remember the plate, make or exact time. These inconsistent details should have raised the case's severity, but were treated as typical in disappearances of the era, where witness memories were dismissed as unreliable from the start. Baker City's small, peaceful nature led most residents to believe serious harm to a child was unlikely. That collective belief caused critical early hours to be lost to complacency. When patrol teams were sent for preliminary checks around South Baker routes, they visually scanned only, without checkpoints, vehicle logs or cordoning off homes and businesses near the scene. Police also didn't note the mint green Ford Marjorie, mentioned briefly, deeming children's descriptions unreliable. The lack of consistent witness accounts further convinced investigators it was a child gone playing case, not one needing urgent response. Community notification was influenced by the "everything will be fine" mindset, leading many to pay only superficial attention when questioned, rather than providing focused, detailed information. Small errors in handling the report, from underestimating the situation, not sealing roads, ignoring the suspicious vehicle description, to downplaying initial statements, all combined into a chain of delays that let the golden opportunity to track Benjamin slip away without leaving necessary investigative marks. And as time passed, investigators still hadn't realized that the complacency of those first hours would become the dividing line between a case that could have been resolved quickly and one that dragged on for more than half a century. The police's initial response, based on the assumption of a lost child, shifted the search for Benjamin to fieldwork without a clear emergency plan, forcing investigators to immediately identify 3 key areas, based on children's usual movements in town, the terrain around Baker City, and where Benjamin was last seen. The route to South Baker Elementary was prioritized first, as it was Benjamin's daily path and the most likely place he'd appear if he'd simply taken a wrong turn. Search teams split into groups along Madison Street, checking yards, side paths, areas around shops, and spots kids often stopped. They covered less traveled sections, narrow backyards, and hidden spots, but found no belongings, footprints, or any sign of Benjamin's presence. The southern forest outside town was added because of its vast, dense terrain and the chance a curious child might wander in. Teams checked trails, small turnoffs, rock crevices and low areas, using long sticks to probe bushes and noting soft ground for footprints. A few adult shoe prints appeared scattered, but couldn't be linked to the victim, while most areas showed no signs of a child passing through at the relevant time. The forest's complex terrain made searching time-consuming with no breakthroughs. The Powder River banks became the third focus, as local kids sometimes played there. Teams walked the river edges, checking access points, reed clusters, and muddy sections that might hold traces. Some indentations in the soil were noted, but didn't match an 8-year-old's size, and many areas had adult footprints from fishermen, reducing analytical value. The strong current and soft mud constantly reshaped the area, erasing any potential traces quickly. The three directions were deemed most feasible under the era's protocols, but yielded no results. No physical evidence, no movement signs, no focal point for expansion. Areas Benjamin could have reached alone were now covered in search team footprints, but none showed he'd been there that morning. The lack of solid leads in all three directions on the first day left the investigation in limbo, while critical time to follow a missing child's trail continued to pass without any foundation for the next steps. In 1951, 8-year-old Benjamin Gray stepped out of his home on Madison Street, holding his small school bag, preparing to head to school like every other morning in Baker City. 5 minutes later, when his sister turned back to look, he had vanished, without a sound, without footprints, without a single item left behind on the dusty road. The search that lasted for months ended in despair. No witnesses, no vehicle identified, not a single piece of solid evidence. The family was reassured that Benjamin had probably wandered into the woods or fallen into the Powder River, and the public gradually accepted it as an unwitnessed accident. The small town spread stories that the boy might have run off with a kind stranger, a rumor repeated to fill the unexplained void. Then, in 2005, at a clinic hundreds of miles from Baker City, an administrative staff member discovered an elderly patient named Daniel Creek, who didn't exist in any national database. When his DNA sample was entered into the system, it matched perfectly with the Gray family line. But it was the fragmented memories he carried that turned everything upside down. A mint green Ford, a gravel road, and a wooden cabin door slamming shut behind him. Someone had taken Benjamin away from the town. Someone knew the exact moment he was walking alone, and someone had kept that secret for more than half a century, until the truth found its way back. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys in search of forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Oregon in 1951 was a land of seemingly unchanging tranquility, where small towns like Baker City existed in a slow-paced rhythm of trust among neighbors. People were used to children walking to school alone, playing around the neighborhood without much fear, because serious crime was rare in the sparse community, where everyone knew each other's faces. In that setting, the Gray family lived in a small wooden house near Madison Street, typical working-class folks in the post-World War II era. Harold Gray worked for the local railroad, while Evelyn stayed home to care for the kids. They had 2 children, Marjorie 10 years old, mature and responsibly minded for her age, and Benjamin 8 years old, lively, curious, always carrying small notebooks to draw maps of the routes he imagined. Benjamin was a boy with bright eyes, who loved chatting with everyone but was also trusting, a trait Evelyn often worried about, though she still believed Baker City was safe enough to ease those concerns. That morning, like any other, the Gray family started the day with familiar calm. Harold prepared to leave for his early shift. Evelyn reminded the kids to dress warmly before heading to South Baker Elementary. Marjorie left a few minutes ahead as usual, while Benjamin followed at a leisurely pace, wearing the red school bag he loved. The short gap between the siblings was never seen as dangerous, since their route mostly passed familiar homes, and a few early opening shops. But that morning, there was one unusual detail no one noticed. A mint green Ford parked near the Madison intersection, its hood slightly protruding into the road, as if waiting for someone. A man sat inside, hands on the steering wheel, eyes following the children passing by. Marjorie walked ahead and didn't notice, but as Benjamin approached the car, he slowed down, seemingly drawn by something from the man inside. That moment happened so quickly that no one in town could recall exactly what occurred, only that Benjamin tilted his head as if listening to a question, then stepped a little closer, and that was the last time he was seen by anyone. When Marjorie turned back to check if her brother was keeping up, Benjamin had completely vanished from the gravel road he walked every day. No screams, no signs of struggle, no items dropped, just a sudden emptiness and an eerie silence. Panicked, Marjorie ran back along the path she'd taken, then in the opposite direction, searching in vain. When she ran home to tell her mother, Evelyn rushed outside, calling his name, and knocking on every neighbor's door along the street. Harold heard the news mid-shift, dropped everything, and raced home. They split up to check every corner, asking anyone who might have passed by at that hour, but all they got were vague, useless recollections. A few said they might have seen Benjamin continuing toward school, but weren't sure. Others thought he'd turned down an alley. No one remembered exact times or reliable details. The first minutes turned into the first hours, calm giving way to panic. Evelyn ran to South Baker Elementary, but found no sign of him. Harold searched the roads where the boy often played, even the nearby park. Helplessness set in as no one had a reasonable explanation. After nearly 2 hours of fruitless searching, Evelyn returned home, hands shaking as she picked up the phone, and for the first time in the Gray family's history, the name Benjamin was reported to the police as a missing child. When Evelyn Gray's call reached the Baker County Sheriff's Office, the information, an 8-year-old child didn't arrive at school, and can't be found, was handled according to 1951 procedures, which did not treat child disappearances as immediate emergencies. In that era's social context, kids often walked miles unaccompanied, sometimes wandered off for hours playing, or visited friends without telling parents. So the initial duty officers assumed Benjamin was just somewhere out wandering. The initial report was logged simply, without risk-level classification or any alert activation. Police asked Harold and Evelyn to double-check friends' houses, ask more neighbors, and report back if he still wasn't found after a few hours. A response reflecting the common complacency of the time. When Harold and Evelyn went to the station in person, the case was taken more seriously, but still not as an emergency. Per protocols then, police filed it as a child wandering, missing person report, and began checking areas a child might reach on their own, rather than approaching it as a possible abduction. No area lockdown was considered, since they believed there were no clear crime signs, no cries for help, no evidence at the scene, no witnesses confirming coercion. However, as statements were collected, the vagueness grew. A witness at the Madison corner only remembered Benjamin walking past but wasn't sure when. A nearby shopkeeper thought he might have seen the boy heading to school, but couldn't recall if it was before or after the school bell. Another vaguely mentioned a light-colored car driving slowly in the neighborhood that morning, but couldn't remember the plate, make, or exact time. These inconsistent details should have raised the case's severity, but were treated as typical in disappearances of the era, where witness memories were dismissed as unreliable from the start. Baker City's small, peaceful nature led most residents to believe serious harm to a child was unlikely. That collective belief caused critical early hours to be lost to complacency. When patrol teams were sent for preliminary checks around South Baker routes, they visually scanned only, without checkpoints, vehicle logs, or cordoning off homes and businesses near the scene. Police also didn't note the mint green Ford Marjorie, mentioned briefly, deeming children's descriptions unreliable. The lack of consistent witness accounts further convinced investigators It was a child gone playing case, not one needing urgent response. Community notification was influenced by the everything will be fine mindset, leading many to pay only superficial attention when questioned rather than providing focused, detailed information. Small errors in handling the report, from underestimating the situation, not sealing roads, ignoring the suspicious vehicle description, to downplaying initial statements, all combined into a chain of delays that let the golden opportunity to track Benjamin slip away without leaving necessary investigative marks. And as time passed, investigators still hadn't realized that the complacency of those first hours would become the dividing line between a case that could have been resolved quickly and one that dragged on for more than half a century. The police's initial response, based on the assumption of a lost child, shifted the search for Benjamin to fieldwork without a clear emergency plan, forcing investigators to immediately identify 3 key areas based on children's usual movements in town, the terrain around Baker City, and where Benjamin was last seen. The route to South Baker Elementary was prioritized first, as it was Benjamin's daily path and the most likely place he'd appear if he'd simply taken a wrong turn. Search teams split into groups along Madison Street, checking yards, side paths, areas around shops, and spots kids often stopped. They covered less traveled sections, narrow backyards, and hidden spots, but found no belongings, footprints, or any sign of Benjamin's presence. The southern forest outside town was added because of its vast dense terrain and the chance a curious child might wander in. Teams checked trails, small turnoffs, rock crevices, and low areas, using long sticks to probe bushes and noting soft ground for footprints. A few adult shoe prints appeared scattered, but couldn't be linked to the victim, while most areas showed no signs of a child passing through at the relevant time. The forest's complex terrain made searching time-consuming with no breakthroughs. The Powder River banks became the third focus, as local kids sometimes played there. Teams walked the river edges, checking access points, reed clusters, and muddy sections that might hold traces. Some indentations in the soil were noted, but didn't match an 8-year-old size, and many areas had adult footprints from fishermen, reducing analytical value. The strong current and soft mud constantly reshaped the area, erasing any potential traces quickly. The 3 directions were deemed most feasible under the era's protocols, but yielded no results. No physical evidence, no movement signs, no focal point for expansion. Areas Benjamin could have reached alone were now covered in search team footprints, but none showed he'd been there that morning. The lack of solid leads in all 3 directions on the first day left the investigation in limbo, while critical time to follow a missing child's trail continued to pass without any foundation for the next steps. The exhaustive focus on the flawed hypothesis around the Powder River area, lasting for weeks without yielding any results, caused the entire investigation process to enter a phase of saturation, and in the following months, all efforts, whether expanding to new areas or revisiting old leads, failed to produce any new evidence. Search teams swept trails, grasslands, southern forests, residential areas, and even locations far beyond the reasonable range a child could travel. But no trace indicated Benjamin had ever been there. No new witnesses, no physical evidence, no matching reports, and no unusual incidents emerged to force investigators to reconsider any hypothesis. The case gradually fell into a repetitive state, checking, verifying, eliminating, then returning to the original starting point. When enough time passed without any additional useful information, the file was shifted to passive status, a form of suspension by the standards of that era, where police could only reopen the case if new witnesses or specific physical evidence appeared. This did not mean the police declared the matter closed, but it did mean they no longer had the resources, data, or new directions to maintain an active investigation. Internal meetings gradually decreased, the search team was disbanded, and the case was only updated with community reports, which became increasingly rare. While authorities had to return to their routine duties, the Gray family did not give up hope, even without the official support they once had. Harold continued searching every week, driving to farther areas, inquiring in surrounding towns, leaving Benjamin's description at stores, gas stations and train stations. Evelyn posted missing child notices in places she believed a stranger might casually see. Marjorie, as she grew a bit older, kept her brother's face in mind, and tried to observe every unfamiliar child in supermarkets or playgrounds. But these individual efforts, lacking information and structure, only gradually exhausted the family. The town of Baker City had initially mobilized a large community effort, but when no concrete results emerged after many months, that enthusiasm began to wane. Residents returned to normal life. Stories about Benjamin's disappearance became sad topics brought up at gatherings, but no longer a priority for action. Gradually, the collective hope of finding the boy faded. Flyers were blurred by wind, memories of that morning became fragmented, and conversations shifted from "we will find the boy" to "perhaps there's nothing more to do." The lengthening silence caused the case to sink deeper into stalemate. No concrete evidence to rebuild an investigative direction, no clear suspect to pursue, and no advanced technology to reanalyze old information. The file at this point was just a stack of papers with scattered notes, mismatched descriptions, and a series of fruitless search efforts. For the investigative resources of 1952, that meant every path had been explored without answers. When the file was placed in passive status, it became one of many cases where police could only hope someone would provide a new lead in the future. The Gray family continued to carry unresolved pain, while the community gradually moved forward, leaving behind an unsolved disappearance and a void that no one in Baker City could fill. The case file had remained dormant in passive status for decades, but the implementation of modern data storage systems later allowed investigators to retrieve old information with a fresh perspective, and it was during this review phase that a name once considered irrelevant began to stand out more clearly: Arthur Mill Creek. Later compiled data from civil records, medical files, employment documents, tax information, land use permits, and scattered reports from the 1940s, 1950s, enabled a reconstruction of Arthur's life history in a way that investigators in 1951 could not achieve. Arthur was born and raised in a small town a few hours' drive from Baker City, worked as a carpenter, and had a stable family until two consecutive tragedies. His wife died from complications of lung disease, and his only son died in an accident at age 4. Medical records noted Arthur showed signs of severe depression lasting many months after these losses, while employment records showed he gradually took frequent leaves before quitting entirely. Arthur's life turned toward isolation when he applied for rights to use a portion of forest land in the Wallowa, Whitman area, citing hunting and building a rest cabin. No records indicated he lived with anyone else, nor was there confirmation he maintained significant social relationships after moving there. Arthur gradually vanished from public activities, no longer attending church, the Carpenters Club, or any community events he had regularly participated in before. These signs, viewed retrospectively, indicated significant social withdrawal, a factor modern investigators consider important in assessing the risk of abduction behavior or creating substitute situations for personal loss. Among the reviewed data, Arthur's travel patterns for purchasing necessities or receiving deliveries from nearby town stores showed he passed through Baker City multiple times. Though no specific documents detailed exact routes, purchase invoices, tool repair receipts, and delivery notes all indicated Arthur regularly used the same path. The segment from the southern forest crossing Madison Street before reaching the town center. This was the exact route Benjamin took to school on the morning he vanished, a coincidence that the 1951 team lacked sufficient data to detect. Checks of transactions around the time of the disappearance showed Arthur had been in town in the weeks nearby, though no evidence confirmed his presence on the exact day Benjamin went missing. However, Arthur's recurring cyclical travel pattern made his presence in the area that morning a possibility that could not be ignored. Additional data from medical and employment records showed Arthur experienced prolonged psychological instability, noted for social avoidance, and attempts to replace lost close relationships with unrealistic forms of attachment. From a modern psychological perspective, this was a disorder that could lead to a need to seek a substitute for the lost child, especially in an era without therapeutic support, and when the individual was completely isolated. These factors combined painted a very different behavioral picture from the initial assessment, and Arthur's isolation, matching travel route, and history of losing a son made him a potential suspect with motive that 1951 investigators had no basis to suspect. In the old data system, there was no record of him ever being considered a suspect, and his deep forest residence meant the community was largely unaware of his existence. When the file was re-examined from a new angle, Arthur emerged as one of the rare individuals satisfying both opportunity and psychological factors, making his name the first highlight in the file reopened after more than half a century. The re-establishment of the Arthur Mill Creek file through later data opened the possibility of re-examining the entire sequence of events on the morning Benjamin vanished. And when investigators in 2006 compiled the victim's statements, though memories were no longer complete, they began constructing a logical sequence of behaviors that the 1951 team lacked enough information to connect. Benjamin's fragmented memories, including the image of a strange man, a cramped space inside a vehicle smelling of wood and machine oil, and the sensation of being taken away from town before he could understand what was happening, were pieced together with data from Arthur's file to form the basis for the reconstruction. From there, the analysis team identified the most likely point of approach as the stretch of road between where Marjorie walked ahead and where she turned back to check on her brother. That distance was sufficient for a vehicle parked on the roadside to carry out alluring action without drawing attention, while also matching the location of the mint green Ford mentioned in initial statements. The perpetrator's approach point was determined to be right at the road's edge, where a vehicle could stop without blocking traffic and without attracting notice from households still preparing for the morning. The timing of the approach focused on the time gap, a very short interval between Marjorie's two glances back at her brother, estimated at just seconds to a minute. For an 8-year-old, a simple question from an adult, or an innocuous offer like "come here for a moment," could make him pause long enough for the perpetrator to open the door and facilitate getting the victim inside. Behavioral analysis of Arthur from later records showed a tendency toward non-violent approaches, fitting the hypothesis that Benjamin did not resist strongly, explaining why there were no cries for help, no dropped items, or signs of struggle. After identifying the approach point, the FBI reconstructed the likely route the perpetrator used to leave town undetected. The most reasonable path was from Madison Street to a side road looping south of town, then merging into a forestry trail, leading to the area where Arthur's cabin was located. This route had the advantages of few homes, no checkpoints or mandatory stops, and near-zero traffic in the early morning. These features allowed the perpetrator to leave the area in minutes without attracting attention. The analysis team also examined mechanisms for avoiding detection in the initial phase. Cars in the 1950s operated with loud engines, but in a town where many families used pickup trucks, logging vehicles, and heavy machinery, such sounds were not distinctive enough to stand out. Moreover, Arthur's vehicle was mint green, a common color at the time, making it hard for witnesses to distinguish. Another key factor was the speed of approach and departure with the vehicle already parked, the perpetrator opening the door at the right moment, getting the child inside, and immediately turning onto the side road. The entire process could occur in tens of seconds. The absence of area lockdown procedures in 1951 also facilitated the vehicle's easy exit from town. No checkpoints, no license plate records, no one monitoring moving vehicles, and no one thinking to check peripheral routes right on the morning of the incident. The FBI reconstruction showed these factors combined to create a plausible scenario. The perpetrator approached Benjamin in a brief moment of isolation, got the victim into the vehicle without creating conflict, left town via a low-traffic route, and disappeared into the forest where he lived in seclusion. The behavioral model built from new data not only explained the lack of traces at the scene, but also rationalized the entire chain of events occurring in an extremely short time. This was the first time in decades that the case had a unified reconstruction, able to link scattered pieces of information into a specific behavior with consistent sequence. The reconstruction of the kidnapper's behavior led investigators toward the forest area where Arthur Mill Creek lived, and when post-incident data officially confirmed the existence of a cabin deep inside the Wallowa, Whitman Forest. This location was immediately considered highly likely to be the site where Benjamin had been held for years. The cabin was dozens of miles from Baker City, situated in complete isolation from main trails, built on land that Arthur had registered for hunting purposes. Accessing the site required navigating narrow dirt roads with no signage, many sections overgrown with vegetation over time. This very remoteness and isolation explained why the cabin had never been discovered during any initial search efforts in the case. When investigators approached the cabin during the re-examination, its structure showed signs of prolonged use. Items such as a handmade wooden bed, a wood-burning stove, tool racks, and basic living supplies were found in a worn condition, but clearly had been used regularly over an extended period. Many objects originated from town, such as canned food, boxes of rice, salt, and inexpensive household items, indicating that Arthur periodically left the cabin to purchase necessities before returning to live alone in the forest. These items confirmed that the cabin was not abandoned, but had served as his sole residence for years. Inside the cabin, the forensics team noted multiple signs that more than one person had lived there. Certain items, like a small drinking cup, an old children's blanket, picture books, and rudimentary wooden toys, suggested the long-term presence of a young child. These objects did not match items reported missing in town, and did not belong to any children living near the forest area at the time. This strengthened the hypothesis that Benjamin had been in the cabin for years, sustained by the supplies Arthur bought from town. Forensic analysis of living conditions revealed that the cabin was simply structured enough to sustain life, but completely lacking in social connection. Natural light entered only through a small window. There was no lighting equipment, no electricity, and no clean water source beyond a stream several hundred meters away. Food was stored in metal containers, or hung high to protect from wildlife. The smell of rotting wood, stove smoke, and dampness clinging to the walls indicated that this cramped space had been continuously occupied through many harsh winters. For a young child, such conditions could foster complete dependence on the captor, as the cabin was not just a residence but the entire world the child experienced daily. A key point in the analysis was why the cabin remained undiscovered for decades. The Wallowa, Whitman Forest is a vast area with complex terrain, trails that shift seasonally, and many sections not clearly marked on old maps. Town residents rarely ventured deep into this region, unless hunting or logging, and even local hunters often avoided areas with steep slopes and large boulders. Arthur's cabin was located in one of the least trafficked zones, isolated from ranger activities, and not on any common travel routes. Furthermore, when Arthur left town to live reclusively, he maintained no broad social ties, meaning no one knew exactly where he lived or could visit. This rendered the cabin invisible to the community for years, and the failure of search teams to expand into this area in 1951 reflected the limitations of mapping technology and manpower at the time. After cross-referencing forensic analyses and investigative data, the cabin was identified as the central crime scene. It showed evidence of prolonged occupancy, contained items related to a young child, provided proof that an adult and a child had lived together for a significant time, and aligned with the behavioral reconstruction of the perpetrator. The cabin became the focal point in understanding how Benjamin disappeared from town without a trace and lived in isolation for so long without detection. The data collected from the cabin laid the foundation for comparison with the victim's testimony years later, and this combination allowed investigators to more clearly identify the stages of adaptation that a completely isolated child undergoes in a secluded environment. Benjamin, despite fragmented memories, described a sequence of experiences consistent with psychological patterns seen in children held captive long-term. The initial stage was confusion and fear, when the child did not understand why he could not return home but still believed adults would come looking. During this time, Arthur controlled the situation by keeping Benjamin inside the cabin, only allowing him outside when necessary and closely supervising every action. Control was achieved not through direct threats, but by restricting information, not telling Benjamin the cabin's true location, not mentioning the distance to town, and convincing the child that leaving was impossible or dangerous. The second stage was environmental adaptation, when initial fear began shifting to situational dependence. Arthur limited Benjamin's activities to repetitive daily routines: eating, staying warm, cleaning the cabin, chopping wood, and reading the few available books. The child had no schedule beyond what Arthur dictated. There was no social interaction, no external information, and no explanation about their location, or why leaving was forbidden. The absolute absence of any comparison to the outside world made the cabin the only frame of reference the child's mind could cling to. The third stage was psychological dependence, which did not form in days or weeks, but over years of exclusive contact with one adult. Arthur's method of information control, depriving access to external reality, limiting knowledge and restricting choices, created a mechanism of dependence, not just for survival, but for perception itself. Benjamin described how Arthur always said the cabin was safe while the outside was a place where everything could hurt children. This wording was not overtly threatening, but framed a worldview that made the cabin seem like the only viable option. The level of social isolation was absolute. No one else ever visited the cabin, there were no human sounds except Arthur's, and no images of normal life for Benjamin to compare and develop a desire to resist. Investigators noted that for a long-term isolated child, the concept of escape does not develop without exposure to something indicating captivity. The complete absence of external information made the cabin the only world Benjamin knew during the most critical years of cognitive development. Dependence grew over time, and was maintained through Arthur's total control of survival needs: food, water, warmth, and protection from wildlife. The child had no ability to independently assess the outside environment, no knowledge of forest paths, no sense of direction to town, and no idea how far the cabin was from his former home. Behavioral analysts concluded that this dependence was not consent, but the result of a long-term control system, in which the child had no alternative but to adapt. A key factor explaining why Benjamin did not run away was that freedom of movement never existed in the early stages, and by the time he was old enough to move independently, his perception of the outside world was completely distorted. Testimony about seeing the surrounding forest as seemingly endless with no way out, or feeling that the cabin was the only place with people, reflected the extent of social restriction that prevented the child from developing the concept of being unlawfully held. Additionally, Arthur's maintenance of some caregiving behaviors, providing food, warmth, and treating minor injuries, while no substitute for real care, reinforced his role as the only person Benjamin could rely on. These factors, combined with the victim's young age at abduction, meant escape was not a cognitively available option. When investigators compiled these descriptions, they determined that Arthur's entire control process relied not on constant violence, but on deprivation of social environment, information restriction, and construction of a closed world where the child had no anchor except the captor himself. Information from testimony and forensic analysis indicated that Arthur Mill Creek died around the mid-1970s, many years after bringing Benjamin to the cabin, with the cause of death concluded from old medical data and seen evidence as cardiovascular complications, consistent with his age and harsh living conditions. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of third-party involvement, and everything in the cabin suggested he died alone, possibly in his sleep or during a sudden heart attack. Arthur's death did not lead to any significant change in the victim's life, as by then Benjamin had lived in the cabin so long and become accustomed to a routine based on repetition. Lacking navigation skills, forest knowledge, or understanding of the distance to town, the boy continued the same lifestyle, using remaining food, maintaining the fire for warmth, gathering firewood near the cabin, and drinking from the stream Arthur had shown him. The behavioral dependence formed early on meant the victim did not recognize Arthur's absence as an escape opportunity. Instead, it became a void he filled by maintaining previously programmed habits. The cabin thus continued functioning as an isolated survival space, with no external influences disrupting that inertia. The cabin's existence for decades without inspection or discovery highlighted gaps in forest land management at the time. The Wallowa, Whitman Forest is a vast rugged area, and from the 1950s to 1970s, ranger oversight focused primarily on fire prevention and logging management, not routine checks of deep forest personal cabins. Illegally built or previously registered cabins were rarely inspected without clear cause, such as unauthorized fires or overhunting. In Arthur's case, the cabin was on legally registered land, generated no notable activity, and lay outside fixed patrol routes, making accidental discovery nearly impossible. The timing of Arthur's death coincided with reduced logging activity, abandoned trails becoming overgrown, further isolating the cabin. In the years after Arthur's death, no one from town reported a missing middle-aged forest dweller, and no incidents prompted authorities to expand checks into such remote areas. This void meant Benjamin's presence went undetected for decades. There were no unusual smoke signals, loud noises, social contacts or strangers entering the area, all contributing to the cabin being a complete blind spot in forest management. Investigators in Baker City received no valuable new leads after 1952 to reactivate the case, as there were no witnesses to unusual forest activity, and no new testimony emerged. The Gray family continued sporadic searches, but their efforts were insufficient to extend deep into the hundreds of miles of forest. Occasional reports to police, such as sightings of strange children or odd men, were checked within town limits and nearby counties, but never led forces near the actual cabin area. This situation persisted for decades, making the period after Arthur's death the longest void in the entire case file. No new data, witnesses, evidence or triggers, forcing authorities to re-examine the forest region where Arthur had lived. This is why the cabin could exist silently for nearly 30 years, while the victim continued living in absolute isolation and silence, beyond the view of any social or investigative system. The 3-decade period following Arthur's death ended when the victim, now an elderly man living in isolation, was forced to leave his cabin to seek medical assistance for a health issue he could no longer manage on his own. A respiratory condition that had worsened over time, causing shortness of breath, dizziness, and an inability to maintain basic daily activities. Visiting a small medical facility on the edge of the forest was something he had rarely done since childhood, and this very action became the pivotal point that triggered a chain of data cross-referencing, placing his identity under suspicion. When hospital staff requested identification as part of the patient intake process, the victim provided information under the name Daniel Creek, a name he had used throughout his adult life, based on vague memories and fabricated details from his years of isolation. However, the state's verification system immediately flagged an anomaly when the identification number he provided did not match any citizen records. This information did not exist in tax databases, did not appear in the Social Security system, and had no matching birth record. The hospital, Following procedures implemented after 2000, immediately sent a verification request to the state's Civil Affairs Department for further investigation. Administrative staff reviewed the information and discovered that not only the identification number, but also the data on place of birth, issuance date, and residence address were inconsistent with any valid citizen record logic. This data caused the system to automatically flag it as suspicious, escalating to an expanded analysis under the authority of the state's Identity Verification Department. As the information underwent multiple layers of cross-referencing, specialists noted no trace of this person's existence in any records prior to his appearance at the medical facility, something nearly impossible for a U.S. citizen of that age. This heightened the level of suspicion, forcing the system to initiate a tracing process by comparing Daniel Creek's identifying characteristics with past reported missing persons cases, particularly unresolved childhood disappearances. The automated search tool forwarded this information to the department handling identity anomalies, leading to an official suspicion: this man was likely a missing person from decades earlier. Although there was no conclusive evidence yet, the shift from paperwork error to possible link to a missing persons case marked the most significant change during the long-stalled investigation. Analysts began comparing estimated age, physical characteristics, health indicators, and other identifiers with the federal missing persons database. Though his true identity was not yet confirmed, Daniel Creek's file was upgraded from administrative irregularity to unverified identity suspicion, meaning a case requiring referral to the appropriate investigative agency. Internal reports at the time clearly noted a significant discrepancy between the data he provided and what the system recorded, compelling relevant agencies to consider the possibility of a long-term missing person case, rare but not unprecedented. As the anomalous file was transferred to state security and then forwarded through procedure to federal agencies for deeper analysis, the case, forgotten since 1952, officially flashed its first signal after more than half a century. From what seemed like a minor medical visit, the case reached a turning point that no one in Baker City back then could have imagined, opening the opportunity to re-examine the entire chain of events once buried in the silence of the deep forest. The anomalous identity information of the man named Daniel Creek was escalated to federal investigation, triggering a mandatory biological verification process, and a DNA sample was collected shortly thereafter to determine whether he was an unregistered individual or linked to an unresolved missing persons case. The DNA sample was collected under forensic standards and sent directly to a laboratory in the Federal Analysis Network, where the data was entered into an automated comparison system against the national database of missing persons and their relatives. This process was designed to detect long-term missing persons cases, especially childhood victims who had never been found. As his genetic data was processed, the system scanned thousands of records, comparing each genetic marker with DNA samples from families of those reported missing since the 1950s. In most cases, the system returned only low compatibility levels, but in the next comparison, a strong match unexpectedly appeared. Daniel Creek's DNA matched a stored sample from a member of the Gray family, a direct relative recorded years earlier, when the Gray family participated in a program to store DNA from relatives of missing persons to aid unsolved cases. The match level far exceeded the threshold for ordinary kinship, indicating a high probability that the man under verification was Benjamin Gray, the child who disappeared in 1951. This result was immediately flagged as a significant discovery and forwarded to the FBI Cold Case Unit, the division specializing in long-dormant, most difficult-to-solve cases. The file, thought to be buried in old paperwork, was now reactivated as a case requiring comprehensive investigation with strong biological evidence at its core. Federal investigators quickly re-examined the DNA data to rule out random coincidence, and upon checking the genetic structure between Daniel Creek's sample and the Gray family relative's DNA, the conclusion was affirmed with near absolute certainty: the two shared very close blood relations, consistent with parent-child, or uncle/aunt-nephew/niece patterns. Since Benjamin's parents had passed away years earlier, the remaining relative sample belonged to a cousin, explaining how the system could successfully match after so many decades. This result was seen as the first key breakthrough in the case resolution process since Benjamin's disappearance 55 years prior. After decades without any useful physical evidence or witnesses, DNA became the first piece strong enough to connect Daniel Creek to his true identity. A case once an absolute deadlock now had the chance to be revisited using modern methods, something impossible in 1951 or any time before the 1990s. With the DNA conclusion authenticated, the FBI Cold Case Unit took over the case and officially reopened the entire Benjamin Gray file as a federal investigation. This marked the first time the case was fully examined using modern forensic technology, rather than relying solely on statements and guesses as in the initial period. The DNA comparison not only confirmed the identity suspicion, but also proved that the victim had not died as many previous hypotheses suggested, requiring the entire case history to be reanalyzed from the start, under the light of the newly discovered scientific evidence. This was the moment the entire investigative system acknowledged that after half a century, they had finally obtained a piece of information that could lead to the truth. The DNA conclusion confirming Daniel Creek as Benjamin Gray forced the FBI Cold Case Unit to return to the entire original 1951 file, and this reopening process allowed old documents, statements, maps, scene reports, interrogation transcripts, collected evidence, and even scattered investigator notes from that era, to be examined through a new lens with the support of modern forensic technology. Statements once deemed vague, particularly Marjorie's account of the mint green Ford, were entered into analysis systems to assess plausibility, rather than dismissed based on subjective judgment as before. Initial maps of the school route, residential areas along Madison Street, the Southern Forest, and the Powder River vicinity were digitized, combined with archived photos and modern topographic data, creating a 3D model to reconstruct not only Benjamin's path, but also potential escape routes the perpetrator might have used to leave town. The timeline reconstruction system showed that the interval between Benjamin leaving home and Marjorie returning to look for him was fully sufficient for a waiting vehicle to approach, make contact, and take a child into the car, without being seen by any witnesses in town, exactly as proven by prior reconstruction data. As investigators cross-referenced old statements with new data, many errors from the initial investigation phase became clear. First was misjudging the nature of the incident, when 1951 police treated it as a lost child case and delayed urgent search measures. Second was failing to immediately seal off key areas, allowing any potential traces in Benjamin's movement range to be erased. Third was not recording or thoroughly analyzing descriptions of the suspicious vehicle, the only factor directly tied to the disappearance moment. The biggest mistake was focusing the investigation on the drowning hypothesis, wasting most time and resources without strong supporting evidence. The old documents, when scanned with modern technology, clearly revealed missed opportunities, exact paths of search teams, times they reached each area, and locations never checked due to faulty assumptions. The timeline reconstruction system also precisely identified blind spots in the search process, pointing out the southern forest and secondary roads inadequately surveyed in the early days, areas later reconstruction proved were the perpetrator's escape routes. Each 1951 hypothesis was reanalyzed. The lost child theory was ruled out due to no footprints, no dropped items, and no credible sightings. The idea of following friends was dismissed as no groups of children were recorded in the area. The Powder River drowning was completely excluded due to lack of supporting evidence and the unrelated shoes. In contrast, the new data, DNA match, Arthur Mill Creek's file, cabin location, route reconstruction, and victim statements, linked into a single logical chain, capable of explaining the entire incident from the start. Behavioral analysis of the perpetrator based on Arthur's file also revealed clear motives consistent with recorded patterns in nonviolent child abductions, especially in the context of a perpetrator traumatized by the loss of his own child. The federal investigators' final conclusion, after cross-referencing all old and new data, affirmed that the 1951 case was not a child wandering off or an accident, but a deliberate abduction executed by exploiting a brief moment of isolation and the community's subjective conditions. This was the first time in 55 years that the case's true nature was determined based on evidence, technology, and sufficiently linked data to fully reconstruct the chain of events on the morning Benjamin disappeared. The conclusion to reopen the case and the analyses related to the kidnapping behavior made verifying the identity of Daniel Creek an essential step that had to be completed to shift from suspicion to official confirmation, and investigators began implementing a multi-layered verification process to confirm that the man who had lived in hiding in the forest for decades was indeed Benjamin Gray. The first layer of verification focused on DNA, comparing his sample with data from the Gray family relatives. The genetic match exceeded the threshold for identifying close kinship, strong enough to confirm that the two sample groups belonged to the same direct bloodline. In addition, the victim's current medical records were cross-referenced with archived health information from Benjamin's records prior to 1951, which noted a small scar on the left collarbone from a bicycle fall when he was very young. Examination of Daniel Creek's body confirmed the existence of the scar with the exact shape and location, a rare and distinctive identifying feature. Old bone injuries, such as healed signs from a broken arm at age 5 recorded in the Gray family's hospital records, also matched perfectly with the victim's X-ray results from treatment in 2005. This medical data, when combined with the DNA conclusion, formed a nearly indisputable biological verification set. The next verification layer focused on physical evidence recovered from the cabin. Items such as old picture books, a few crude wooden toys, and a piece of fabric that had been mended multiple times matched Evelyn Gray's descriptions of items Benjamin often carried or that his mother had sewn for him. Despite the long passage of time causing most items to deteriorate, forensic experts still determined there were traces consistent with them having been used by a child aged around 8 to 10 during the initial period of residence in the cabin. Notably, a small notebook containing simple drawings, childlike maps depicting paths around the house and fields, matched the map drawing habit that the family had described in Benjamin. Although handwriting could not be identified, the notebook's content became a form of material memory that helped strengthen the connection between the victim and the child who went missing in 1951. Parallel to the physical evidence, fragmented memories recounted by the victim during several sessions with the investigation team were cross-matched with historical events from the Gray family. He remembered a house with a white fence, a dirt road that smelled of dust when it was hot, the distant sound of a train whistle every morning, details that significantly matched the living environment of the Gray family when Benjamin was young. Memories of people were more fragmented, only recollections of a woman with long hair and a soft voice, possibly a retained image of Evelyn. Though not clear enough to stand as independent evidence, these memory fragments, when cross-referenced with family historical data, formed a consistent picture of the victim's origins. After completing all verification layers, DNA, medical records, biological markers, cabin evidence, fragmented memories, and geographical data, the FBI prepared an identity verification report in accordance with standards for long-term missing persons cases. The report concluded that there was sufficient scientific basis and investigative data to determine that Daniel Creek was Benjamin Gray, the victim missing since 1951. The report was marked as positive identification and forwarded to federal agencies responsible for managing missing persons records, while also notifying representatives of the Gray relatives. The official announcement followed, confirming that the disappearance spanning more than half a century had finally identified the true identity of the missing person ending the longest period in the case's history during which the victim had existed outside all societal recording systems. The official verification of Daniel Creek's identity as Benjamin Gray presented the next requirement for the FBI Cold Case Unit, organizing a controlled reunion between the victim and surviving relatives, conducted according to safety protocols for cases involving long-term separation from family and the risk of trauma upon re-exposure to the past. Investigators worked with psychologists, victim assistance agencies, and Gray family representatives to arrange the location, timing, and contact conditions to ensure mental stability for both sides. The meeting was not held immediately, but through multiple preparatory steps, including direct notification to the family, confirmation of their readiness to meet, and assessment of the victim's ability to receive information without crisis. When the Gray family, now with only sister Marjorie as the surviving direct relative, agreed to proceed, the FBI gathered additional non-biological data to support recognition during the meeting. Details such as childhood habits, the location of the old house, names of former neighbors, family items used, familiar stories, and photos from old albums were all included in the verification list. The purpose of this step was not to prove identity, which had already been confirmed by DNA, but to create an emotional recognition foundation to help the victim connect with memories still retained in his subconscious. When the reunion took place at a neutral facility with psychological support staff on standby, the recognition process was conducted in a controlled manner. Marjorie, now in her 70s, faced the man who had once been the little brother she lost at age 10. Differences in age, appearance, and life experiences made direct recognition impossible based solely on visual memory, but non-biological factors began creating emotional connections. A faint smile, she said, was identical to their father's, a walking posture slightly leaning to the right from the childhood bike fall, and the habit of twisting two fingers when anxious, a behavior Benjamin had shown since childhood. The victim, despite fragmented memories, responded to some details Marjorie mentioned. When she described the white fence in front of the house, he recognized a vague image that had appeared in his dreams. When she mentioned the early morning train whistle, he confirmed it was a familiar sound from his distant memories. Each piece of data was not strong enough to restore complete memories, but sufficient to create emotional recognition for both. A special connection between those who had shared childhood and one who had lived a life detached from the world. Following the initial recognition, the process of re-establishing family ties was implemented through multiple scheduled supervised meetings. The FBI and psychologists continued to create a stable environment for the victim and relatives to share information in a controlled way, avoiding cognitive overload. Early sessions focused on simple family stories, names of pets, Evelyn's kitchen habits, Harold's work, and memories Marjorie still retained. Through these sessions, the victim began recovering fragmented memories, not in sequence but enough to form an emotional picture of life before the abduction. Experts assessed that re-exposure to relatives, especially one who had witnessed the final period before the kidnapping, helped activate long-term memory areas the victim had never had the opportunity to recover during decades of isolation. Each detail Marjorie provided became an anchor for the victim to visualize key events, such as the path they took to school, the small kitchen where Evelyn baked, or the table where Benjamin used to draw maps. These details not only helped restore awareness of origins, but also played a role in psychological stabilization, recreating a sense of belonging to a family the victim had never known he lost. As memories gradually expanded, the siblings began rebuilding their relationship based on respect and emotional support rather than restoring traditional family roles. This was important because the victim had lived most of his life as someone without family, so re-establishing bonds needed to occur gradually, supervised and without pressure. Though unable to compensate for the lost years, the reunion process opened opportunities to recover part of his personal identity, helping the victim understand that his time separated from society was not the entire picture of his life. The reunion and subsequent meetings thus became the foundation for rebuilding the concept of the past, helping the victim reconnect with what had been his before the abduction story began. The reunion process between Benjamin and his relatives opened the next phase that the FBI and civilian agencies had to handle, re-establishing legal identity for a citizen who had disappeared from the system for more than half a century. The first step was restoring valid identification documents, a complex task because Benjamin Gray's original records had been closed in 1952 and later moved to historical archives. Legal specialists coordinated with the Oregon Vital Records Office to reactivate the birth certificate, change the status from missing to found, and update identification information based on current biometric data. The goal was to restore Benjamin's legal status as a U.S. citizen with full rights, removing all layers of false identity he had been forced to use during his isolated life. Once basic documents were restored, his data was integrated into state and federal systems, including Social Security databases, national health records, and identification records. This update had to be done carefully, not only to avoid information errors but also to protect the victim's personal safety. The system flagged the case as special, restricting public access and requiring multi-layer authentication for any agency wishing to view the records. This is the procedure applied to victims who had been held captive or lived outside the system for extended periods to prevent misuse of personal information. Concurrently, the FBI and state media agencies had to manage information about the reunion to prevent excessive spread. Because Benjamin's case was rare and attention-grabbing, the risk of privacy invasion and media pursuit was high. A confidentiality plan was established providing only minimal information to the press, not disclosing residence, therapy schedules or personal details, while supporting the family in declining interviews during the initial phase. This helped the victim avoid public pressure while adjusting to life after re-emergence. Psychological support was the most critical pillar in the post-reunion phase. The victim had lived most of his life in an isolated environment, so entering modern society required long-term therapy. Experts analyzed that social deviance, time perception disorders, and lack of basic urban living skills were unavoidable. Benjamin was assigned a specialized therapy team, including psychologists, social rehabilitation specialists, and medical advisors to help him adapt to basic elements like moving in crowded areas, processing information quickly, accessing technology, managing finances, and healthy social interactions. Therapy sessions were designed at a slow pace based on his receptivity, aiming to help him build concepts of safety, self-determination and choice, things that had been completely restricted during his isolation. Community reintegration steps also had to be implemented gradually. Initially, he lived with close support from victim assistance agencies and voluntary family oversight. He was guided to participate in light activities in small settings, outdoor walks, limited meetings with Marjorie's neighbors, and small-scale community events. The goal was to help him adjust to the pace and sense of belonging in a social environment. Later, more complex activities like visiting stores, familiarizing with public transportation, or learning to use modern devices were added gradually. Though not expecting him to fully integrate into modern society like a typical adult, experts assessed that each small step was a positive sign of recovering identity and personal rights. The most important aspect of this phase was ensuring Benjamin accessed a world he had been deprived of for decades in a safe, supported way without overload. Thanks to the combination of legal support, information security, psychological therapy, and reintegration planning, his life began forming a new structure, one that for the first time in over half a century, allowed him to decide his own direction. Benjamin's reintegration occurred alongside a new investigative direction launched after the final search of Arthur Mill Creek's cabin, as among the evidence recovered were items that could not be directly linked to Benjamin, raising suspicions that the cabin may have been used to hold more than one victim. Certain objects, such as scraps of fabric with patterns that did not match the clothing descriptions provided by the Gray family, a button from a type manufactured after Benjamin's abduction, and several rudimentary toys sized differently from what would suit his age when first taken into the forest, led federal investigators to consider the possibility that other children had been present at the cabin during Arthur's lifetime. These pieces of evidence, though limited and not strong enough to confirm the presence of a second victim, were entered into the process of cross-referencing with missing persons records from the same period, particularly cases of children who disappeared in Oregon, Idaho, and Washington from the late 1940s to the mid-1960s. The NCIC Missing Persons Database, combined with archived records from local police, was thoroughly reviewed to identify cases with similar characteristics in age, gender, or circumstances. Some records showed initial matches, such as children who went missing while playing near the forest, or cases where no body was found, and were subjected to deeper analysis. However, no DNA samples or evidence descriptions sufficiently matched the items found at the cabin. The analysis of whether Arthur had multiple victims focused on psychological and behavioral factors. Later records indicated he suffered major trauma from the loss of his son, lived in isolation, and showed a tendency toward substitute attachment with young children. But there were no signs of repeated violence, no pattern of escalation, and no evidence that he ever left the cabin for extended periods to seek new victims. The behavioral profile in Benjamin's case leaned more toward a replacement child motive than a serial abduction pattern. Nevertheless, the FBI had to expand the scope of the investigation, reviewing all reports of missing children with unclear causes in the area, interviewing those who had lived near the Wallowa, Whitman Forest during Arthur's lifetime, and comparing DNA from the cabin evidence with unidentified profiles. All verification steps yielded insufficient evidence. No family recognized the evidence, no additional DNA matched missing persons data, and no witness statements indicated Arthur had ever appeared with children other than Benjamin. The final investigative report noted that the possibility the cabin had held additional victims could not be entirely ruled out, but there was no evidence to conclude it. A supplemental file was opened per protocol for the unidentified evidence, and this file continued to be maintained in the system as an unresolved case. However, by the time the investigation concluded, no new information had emerged to support the hypothesis of a second victim. Thus, although Arthur's cabin left some unanswered questions, the available data did not allow for the conclusion that Benjamin's tragedy was part of a repeated pattern of behavior. The reopening and resolution of Benjamin Gray's file, after more than half a century, forced Oregon authorities to re-examine the entire 1951 investigative process, and from this analysis, numerous procedural errors were identified more clearly than ever before. Internal evaluation reports pointed out that treating the disappearance as a lost child case, rather than applying emergency protocols, created an irrecoverable time gap, causing initial traces to be completely overlooked. The failure to secure the scene, conduct a comprehensive area search, screen suspicious vehicles, and establish suspect tracking files led to a series of misguided decisions, diverting the investigation toward a drowning hypothesis and neglecting criminal possibilities during the most critical early phase. These shortcomings, once compiled into a summary report, provided momentum for Oregon investigative agencies to improve protocols for handling missing children, particularly through the implementation of early, systematic and flexible response mechanisms. Experts proposed a risk classification model from the very first moment a report is received, in which every case of a child missing under unclear circumstances must be treated as an emergency until proven otherwise. Task assignment systems were redesigned to ensure the initial scene is protected before any spontaneous community searches, while clearly specifying timelines for mobilizing search teams, vehicle screenings, witness documentation, and cross-referencing lists of strangers in the area. One of the most significant impacts of the case was the recognition of DNA as a central tool in identifying long-term missing persons. Previously, Oregon only stored DNA from suspects and victims in active criminal cases, but after Benjamin Gray's case was solved through genetic matching, the state began expanding voluntary DNA collection programs from relatives of missing persons. Building a genetic database for cold cases became a priority, creating opportunities to revisit cases that had been frozen for decades. Oregon also collaborated with federal laboratories to standardize DNA matching processes and establish periodic scanning mechanisms to detect potential matches as new data was added. Another major impact was the shaping of the state's cold case unit, which had previously operated informally with part-time personnel. Following Benjamin Gray's case, Oregon decided to restructure the unit, putting into operation a dedicated analysis team consisting of forensic experts, veteran investigators, and psychological consultants. The cold case unit was tasked with reviewing historical files, applying new technologies, and maintaining access to federal data to reopen cases with resolution potential. The case became a prime example in state training courses and guidance materials, emphasizing the importance of not ruling out criminal hypotheses in the initial hours of handling missing children reports. The long-term influence of the case extended beyond Oregon, as other states used the Benjamin example to adjust initial response protocols and upgrade investigative capabilities. State-federal reporting systems were strengthened. Local police departments were required to fully archive information from child disappearance cases and maintain regular contact with federal agencies to ensure all cold cases are reconsidered as forensic technology advances. The case served as proof that a file thought to have no hope could still find resolution through the right combination of technology, procedures, and investigative determination. As a result, Oregon's investigative system in particular, and that of the United States in general, increasingly focused on the ability to revisit historical cases, recognizing that time is not always an absolute barrier if genetic evidence and data are properly preserved. The impacts of the case, along with the broader changes in Oregon investigations, unfolded alongside Benjamin's personal journey after reuniting with his family, and this phase became the focus for psychologists and those directly supporting him in rebuilding a life after half a century of stripped identity. The memory recovery process continued under professional guidance, using cognitive therapy, exposure therapy, and controlled recollection methods to activate long-term memories that had been blocked during years of isolation. Initial sessions focused on familiar elements, images of the old family home, the sound of trains, the smell of mother's baking, childhood objects preserved in family photos. As psychological safety gradually stabilized, specialists expanded the memory scope using assisted recollection technology, showing footage of Baker City's neighborhoods in the 1950s, reconstructing models of the Gray home, or recreating the route the two sisters once took to school. Each time a memory was recovered, even if only for a few seconds, Benjamin was encouraged to record it in his own words, helping reinforce the awareness that those images belonged to him rather than stories told by others. Alongside memory recovery, rebuilding family relationships became a crucial foundation. Marjorie, now elderly, served as the sole bridge between Benjamin and his past. The two met regularly under light supervision from support staff, gradually shifting from hesitant conversations to more intimate sharing sessions. Rather than trying to restore the interrupted sibling bond, they built a new form of relationship based on empathy and understanding. Marjorie helped Benjamin revisit his lost childhood, while Benjamin provided Marjorie with the comfort that her search for her brother had never been in vain. Over many months, family connections expanded as cousins, the generation that had never known him, were cautiously introduced into Benjamin's life, bringing a sense of belonging to a social network he had never experienced. Meanwhile, reshaping personal identity was the most challenging process, as Benjamin had lost not only memories, but also the sense of being a person existing in society. He had to confront the reality that most of his life had been formed outside the world, in an environment without choices, freedom, or opportunities for self-development. Specialists helped him construct a new identity concept based on three elements: his own current perspective, restored family relationships, and the values he wanted to maintain in his remaining years. Therapy sessions focused on helping him name emotions, recognize the difference between his own experiences and societal expectations, thereby shaping a version of identity, not based on what he had lost, but on what he could choose from this point forward. Social reintegration proceeded at a slow but steady pace. Initially, he was guided in adapting to simple elements, like joining small activity groups, learning to use a phone, communicating with medical staff, and managing personal time. Later, he was encouraged to participate in connecting activities such as community reading sessions, adult craft classes, and short guided outings. Each small step helped reduce his sense of alienation from modern society and strengthen his feeling of control over life. Though he could not fully integrate like an adult with a complete social foundation, Benjamin gradually found a rhythm suited to himself, a stability he had never known during 55 years isolated from the world. Ultimately, as life began to stabilize in his later years, Benjamin was arranged to live in a semi-independent assisted facility for elderly individuals who had experienced long-term trauma. There he had the necessary privacy, while still receiving medical, psychological, and social support. He maintained regular contact with Marjorie, followed a consistent routine, and gradually developed a sense of peace that his life had rarely known. Though he could not regain the lost years, Benjamin found a different form of wholeness: presence, acknowledgement, and self-determination, things that allowed him to enter his final years with a restored identity. The journey of the Benjamin Gray case, when viewed in its entirety, from that morning in 1951 to the moment of identity confirmation in 2006, reflects a series of overlapping phases involving human effort, procedural errors, and groundbreaking advances in investigative technology. The case began with the sudden disappearance of an 8-year-old boy in Baker City, followed by a series of misguided investigative directions, from the lost child hypothesis to drowning, leading to the file being closed when no evidence was strong enough to keep it active. For decades, no one knew that Benjamin was still alive in an isolated cabin under Arthur Mill Creek's control, then continued surviving alone after the man's death. Only in 2005-2006, when a minor anomaly in medical records exposed an identity discrepancy, did the case begin moving again, and when the DNA sample was matched against the missing persons database, the link to the Gray family became the breakthrough that revealed the full truth. Subsequent forensic analysis, timeline reconstruction, cabin evidence review, and victim interviews fully recreated the abduction, the perpetrator's control mechanisms, and Benjamin's rare survival over 55 years. The case was thus not only a journey to recover a person missing for over half a century, but also direct proof of DNA technology's revolutionary role in solving cold cases. Before the 1990s, child disappearances without witnesses or evidence like Benjamin's were nearly impossible to resolve. But DNA, with its ability to match across generations and reconstruct blood relations, broke those limits by creating a bridge between victim and family, even as time erased all other traces. The National DNA Database, originally built for criminal investigations, became a tool for identifying long-term missing persons and opening paths for cases once deemed hopeless. Beyond technological advances, the case also highlighted important procedural lessons stemming from the 1951 errors. Treating the missing child as a lost case, delaying scene security, overlooking key witnesses, failing to analyze suspicious vehicle descriptions, and focusing too early on an accident hypothesis were systemic mistakes. From these, Oregon investigations improved rapid response protocols, strengthened initial risk classification upon report receipt, enhanced area vehicle screenings, applied behavioral analysis, and implemented modern mapping technology in event reconstruction. These adjustments helped shape modern standards for investigating child disappearances and minimize the gaps that once left Benjamin's case in prolonged deadlock. The case's social significance extended beyond the state, raising questions about community responsibility, the limits of awareness regarding isolated individuals, and the value of maintaining missing persons databases as an essential part of national security. Legally, the case provided grounds for expanding relative DNA storage programs, improving citizen identity management regulations, and strengthening protections for survivors long separated from society. Professionally, Benjamin Gray became the clearest illustration that a seemingly hopeless case could still be solved when technology and procedures advance enough to compensate for earlier limitations. In practical terms, the case was not only the closure of a 55-year journey to recover a person, but also a flagship case study taught in investigative training programs across the United States, emphasizing the importance of not ruling out any hypothesis in the early stages, the impact of DNA in cold cases, and the role of persistence in pursuing justice. The Benjamin Gray case thus became part of the legacy of modern investigations, reminding us that truth can be buried for a very long time but never truly lost. It only awaits the right tools and the right moment to be uncovered. Looking from today's America, the Benjamin Gray story is not just a cold case solved after 55 years, but a very specific reminder of things we can still easily repeat. In 1951, Baker City believed small towns were safe, so when Benjamin disappeared, police treated it as getting lost, delayed securing the scene, overlooked the mint green Ford detail, and focused efforts on the river with a drowning theory, despite no clear evidence. In modern America, we have Amber Alerts, cameras, digital data, but the "it's probably nothing" mindset still lingers. Parents think the kid is just running late. Neighbors hesitate to report because they fear overreacting. Police can sometimes be guided by biases. The lesson here is in the first hours of a child going missing, it's better to overreact than to delay. If there's anything unusual like a strange car near the school, note it, report it immediately, and don't dismiss it because you think I might not remember clearly. The story of the forest cabin and a child growing up in isolation also points to a very American issue: people living off the grid, outside the system. Benjamin existed for decades without records, insurance or ID. Only when a medical record didn't match, and DNA was cross-checked against the missing persons database, did the truth emerge. This underscores the importance of families consenting to store DNA in support programs for finding loved ones, and of a system that respects privacy, but is strong enough to connect those lost pieces. Finally, Benjamin's journey to recover his identity after reunion reminds us that surviving violence or abduction doesn't end at being found. It requires therapy, long-term support, and a community that knows how to listen without judgment. In America today, each of us can start with very specific actions: taking dangers around children seriously, supporting DNA programs for cold cases, and treating victims as people rebuilding their lives, not just characters in a sensational story. Thank you for joining this deeply humane and sobering story. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe to the channel to continue exploring with us those files, thought long forgotten, but still carrying powerful reminders for the present. See you in the next video, where we continue the journey of uncovering truth and the things that deserve to be brought to light.